So welcome, Dan. We so appreciate your leadership. And as always, it sets you in all things by acknowledging our creator, by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We acknowledge all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So Dan, can you please introduce yourself and your remarkable work to our listeners and viewers?
Awesome. Well, Victor, it's just I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today. I'm Dan Clement. I'm President and CEO of United Way Centraide Canada. So I think some of your listeners might know us, generally United Way Centraide is well known, but we're the national office. I'm the CEO of the national office, and so we have 67 United Ways and Centraides across Canada. And just to give you a sense of what our national office does, it's kind of like twofold, right? The concept of a backbone organization, we often talk about that in collective impact. In a lot of ways, that's kind of what we do inside United Way and Centraide. So, one of our jobs is to provide direct supports to the 67 United Ways and Centraides across Canada. It's like member development. What are the issues facing our organizations? Where do we need to get better and build capacity? Building some national partnerships that engage our national movement, but even like risk management and brand and all of those things that you kind of need to do in a sector like ours. So that's kind of the first thing we do. The second thing that we do is both as a national organization and an impact organization in our own right? So very much we're focused on what are the issues that matter to Canadians, what's affecting the well-being of our communities. And as a national office, we have that opportunity to kind of learn from our network of United Ways and their partners and start to elevate that into our national conversation. So on social policy issues, issue leadership, the health of the charitable sector and the community services sector. That's part of the role that we play. But just to give you a sense of the breadth of the network, if that's helpful to you, we're in all regions of Canada. Rural, urban, north, east, west, about 5,000 communities across Canada have a United Way presence. And collectively, we mobilize about 600 million a year, every year. So I often say to folks, that's money that gets raised by Canadians and corporate partners and foundations every year. And every year it goes out into community to do the good works of community organizations. And so that's those resources help us support about 3,500 community organizations across the country. They deliver about 6,000 programs, and somewhere around 1 in 3 Canadians get touched by those programs delivered by community services. So poverty reduction, basic needs, child and youth development, but also community building. And I think that's really important. It's not just delivery of services, it's our community service network really does work to bring communities together and to create opportunity for shared action at the local neighborhood and community level. So that gives you a little bit of sense of United Way Centraide writ large, but also the role we play, inside that network and in our shared community of the charitable and nonprofit sector.
That's absolutely remarkable, sir. The breadth, the scope, the depth, the scale. Thank you so much for your candor, leadership, and all the concepts you provided. So my next question is, what inspires you about your current work? What's lighting your fire? What has you passionate and curious right now?
It's a really good question. And here's the way I think about it, because, you never get that question, what gets you up in the morning? and there's a whole set of issues that we want to work hard on. But for me, I've been in the community nonprofit sector for 25 years, in a privileged position in many ways, the opportunity to work on a lot of different initiatives. And I always say this to people, as your career goes on, you'll have great opportunities to work on amazing projects, or certainly hope that you will. And some of them are going to succeed and some of them aren't, right? And I always remember the projects, but what I really get inspired on is not actually the projects, it's the relationships, the people I actually worked with. Because at the end of the day, I don't know if you've had this experience, but you work on an initiative and sometimes you succeed or don't, but you reflect back, you say, well, what did I experience? What did I learn? who did I get to work with that changed my perspective? And maybe I'll just share a quick example of this, if that's helpful. And I'm going to go way back. And maybe I can share, and I got another perspective on this that I'll share. But early on my days in the United Way, one of the first meetings I went into, and I can remember it with absolute clarity, but we were talking about the challenges Canadians had accessing community services, right? It's hard to navigate, hard to find them. Sometimes you have lots of issues. Not everybody serves every issue. And the idea on the table was we need to elevate this work and create 3-digit dialing 211 to accelerate the ability of Canadians to access services. And I remember the idea, and I remember the people in the room, and I remember people saying, to do this, we're going to have to do it together. We're going to have to take all of the skills of United Way, of the information referral sector, and outside partners. In 2 years, we secured the number from the CRTC, and we launched the very first service in Canada in Toronto. 25 years later, it exists all across Canada, in all regions, and it's a staple. So I love the project, but the best thing I learned about that was you can't get it done alone. You need good partners. You need to bring your strengths combined with somebody else's strengths. And so that for me is inspiring. The project's inspiring because the problem was challenging, but the people who got it done was what really inspired me. And I think this is probably relates well to the type of work that you do, but that's all about collective action. Like we can all wake up and say, well, what is my organization going to do on X issue? But we work on social determinants of health. We work on poverty. We work on equity issues. And the reality is not one of our organizations, and not United Way, even with the resources that we deploy, can do and solve these problems on our own. So the idea of finding partners and being willing to work together, I'm just motivated by it. And we just lived through a really crazy pandemic. We're coming out of it into a cost of living crisis, which is affecting Canadians. And I don't know about you, but collaborating and doing collective work is hard. And yet when there's a big crisis, people drop their agendas. They figure out we got to do something together because it's a crisis, right? So we really tried to live that through the pandemic. When I think about some of the federal government programs that got delivered, and we had a privilege to support, like the Emergency Community Support Fund and now the Community Services Recovery Fund. There's no way we could do that on our own. We needed to work with others, right? And I guess the message that if I could share one message, when the disaster or the crisis goes away, everybody goes back to the way they used to work. And so I'm really trying and working with my team to kind of keep that spirit of, no, we're kind of in a crisis all the time these days. If you really think about it, we've got to stay working together. So I don't know if that's helpful. That's kind of what inspires me, what keeps me going, but also what I find fun and interesting about the working in this sector.
I couldn't agree more. At SETC, data is a love language. So you sharing that narrative on 2-on-1 is beautiful. And we believe in the 3 R's: relationship, resources, and reciprocity. A lot of times, some sectors operate like dysfunctional families. They only come together for weddings and funerals. And I think that we have to find ways and means to build communities of practice and stay connected, pull tighter together. But despite differences, regions, orienting, like we have to work together. I agree completely. So my next question is, what challenges and barriers do you and your colleagues face in your work, and how are you and your team working to overcome them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I can think about this in 2 ways, but one is, every day I work in a big, large network of United Ways, and we have lots of challenges and opportunities. And if you want, I can dig into some of that, but I really want to maybe reflect a little bit on what's on our minds, because I think it really is influencing our work, who we're working with, how we're working as a national office of United Way Centraide Canada, but also in our sector. And I think, so let's just talk about community services in Canada and the state of community services in Canada. we have, as I mentioned, we've just come out of a pandemic, right? Which was a challenge for community services and Canadians. We've entered a cost of living crisis. We know that Canadians are turning to community services for support, for basic needs, for housing, for shelter. So I pulled out a couple of statistics that I thought might be interesting just to share. And some of them are some of them are just what we're hearing from networks and from our own ecosystem of agencies. But here's just a couple of facts or interesting tidbits that I think are important because they speak to a real challenge in front of us. Demand for services is up. I'm sure you're hearing this, Victor, right? Like community organizations of all sizes faced a big increase in service demand, often from Canadians who never used to seek services from community services, but demand for services went up, and it has stayed up. So I talked about 211, calls to 211 for community mental health and addictions, for financial supports, for food security and housing, up 20%, sustained. So that's a barometer of what people are calling about and what their challenges. That tells us that the demand keeps going up. 1 in 5 Canadians are telling us that they're looking to community services for basic needs. Like that's 20% of Canadians. 57% of agencies are reporting that they cannot meet the needs that are coming at them. Right, 40% are saying that those needs are sustained at a high level. I'm going to keep going because it tells us the point. Childcare is essential to our economy, to the capacity for families to enter the workforce. We have a big childcare program going across the country. We can't fill all the spaces because we don't have the employees in the sector. Rates of volunteerism fell during the pandemic. They didn't come back. Cost of living is going up. That means the cost of service delivery has gone up. So I share all of these things, and the Giving Report from Canada Helps does an amazing job of capturing some of these. So if anybody really wants to dig in, it's a great resource. But what does all of this mean? And I think this is when you ask, like, what's the challenge? And for an organization that's investing in thousands of community services across the country, this is a challenge. Agencies are reporting concern about burnout of their frontline staff. They're having a hard time retaining staff. They are having a hard time recruiting. The YMCA WorkWell program did a survey of the nonprofit sector and nonprofit workforces. And one of the things they reported was 1 in 3 employees are saying that they're facing burnout and thinking that they might leave the sector. Canadians depend on community services to meet their basic needs, to find a place to engage in their community. And I think the question and the challenge that's on our mind is who's caring for these organizations and for these frontline workers, and what are we doing to build strong, resilient community services? So, Victor, that's what's on our mind. Like, that's the big challenge that I think is in front of us, and it has many dimensions to it. And I've got some ideas, and we've got some ideas on how we're trying to work on this. I'm happy to share some of that, but that's the big challenge.
That's a perfect segue to my next question. Do you have a set of key priorities right now in your work?
We do. So I guess, we've already covered the context, right? So I won't go back over that because I think that just sets the stage of demand versus where the sector at. So earlier I talked about the Community Services Recovery Fund. So one of the reasons that both the United Way Centraide Canada, but also many of our partners like the YMCA, YWCA, National Association of Friendship Centers, Boys and Girls Clubs, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and many, many others, we got together and we said, this is a really challenging context. So there was a lot of advocacy done to secure that program. But we're in the midst of delivering that with our partners at Community Foundations and Canadian Red Cross and many others, including yourselves, are playing a role in the delivery of that program. So again, goes back to no one organization can do it, right? We've all got to come together to figure out how to deliver, but we are in the middle of that. And the good news is all of those dollars are out in the community. Organizations are deploying those projects. So later this year, we're going to start to see, what can we learn? What is it telling us about what organizations needed? Where did the dollars go, and where are some of the gaps that might need future investments? And I can tell you, Victor, the amazing story here is that, we talk $400 million, sounds like a lot of money. The demand from the sector was way, way beyond that. So it tells us that the need is there. I guess the other big priority for us, and it ties back to what I just talked about in terms of the community services sector, but we believe, and many other organizations are engaged in this as well, that we need a labor force strategy for community services. So it does not exist. There is not one. And yet, we have thousands of organizations that employ tens of thousands of people, often and majority women-led organizations, very diverse workforce. And we don't have a strategy that builds a pathway for people to say, I want to work in this sector. We don't have strategies to support retention and recruitment. We don't have well-developed strategies to train and support organizations to build capacity, to be strong and resilient. So we've really identified a labor force strategy as a critical missing gap. It's a priority for organizations like Imagine, for us, for community service federations. ONN is involved in this, and many, many others. So we see this as an area of development that I think is critical. If we want a strong community services sector that's going to be here for the long term, we're going to need to do some work here. So that's a big project, both for us, but in partnership with others, to say, like, what does it mean? What is it going to take? What's the role of government? How do we fund it? And what do we support? So maybe I'll stop there. Those are the delivery of the Community Services Recovery Fund is a big project, without a doubt. But this labor force strategy, I think, is going to be a really important new scope of work for a lot of our organizations in the sector to come together around.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, especially in this season. So thank you so much for your leadership and for sharing. So this is my second last question.
Sure.
How do you feel about the future of philanthropy in Canada? Obviously, you provided some context. You provided a few of your priorities, but I'd love to hear, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? How do you feel about the future of philanthropy in Canada?
It's a great question. So I have, my first perspective always is, I really am a believer that Canadian public is generous. And I think we see it all the time, right? Sometimes we see it in formal gifts that are recognized as charitable contributions. But anytime there's a local disaster, what do Canadians do? Find food, help their neighbors. They don't ask, for thanks, but and it's not always captured and recognized. So that always makes me hopeful, because I think that's it's part of the fabric of a strong civil society, and I think it's there. But there are some areas to be worried about. So a couple of things, and I'm sure you've heard this in your work, but there are every year fewer donors giving in Canada. That's not a new trend, it's a long-term trend. The flip side of that is those who are giving more. So they're helping to make up that gap. But at the end of the day, if fewer Canadians are able to give or are giving, that's something we need to pay attention to. And for me, it has implications in a couple of ways that are important. One, it's really driving many organizations to focus on leadership giving or major giving or transformational giving, right? So larger gifts, excellent, impactful, important. But you know this, Victor, not every organization in the community services sector has the capacity to do that type of work, the processes to put in place, the staffing to go after those types of gifts. So that's a problem in a sector that doesn't necessarily have equal distribution of dollars, if that's where philanthropy is heading. So I think we got to pay attention to that. The other big thing that's important is the more you go into leadership major or transformational giving, often it drives people to restricted gifts or targeted gifts. One of the big tenets of United Way that we believe in is unrestricted giving. Giving that actually goes back to community and goes to mission. right? At the end of the day, organizations and community services in particular, they need donors to be focused on supporting their mission, willing to fund their staff, willing to fund their administration, because unrestricted mission-based giving is the dollars that allow flexibility, adaptability, and innovation. It gives you the ability to say, here's what my community needs, and I have supporters who invest in the delivery of my mission in the community. So for me, if I had one message to share, Victor, is I am hopeful because I believe Canadians are generous. And my second message here is going to be, if you've got the opportunity to give, please do so. Now is the time. Not everybody does. Not everybody, you know, in right now with the cost pressures facing families, not everybody does. But if you are giving, this is my main message. Really, we all need to think about, let's fund the mission of our organizations. Let's not worry about picking the project because that flexible money will allow organizations to respond in the way that communities need them to respond, not in the way that the donor thinks they need to respond to community. And you know this, and I know this, and I think many people know this. The smartest people who have the best answers to solving problems are the people who live in the community.
Absolutely.
Our job is to give them resources and opportunity to action that work, not to tell them what to do. So that I think is really important.
I couldn't agree more. When donors drive outcomes, it's tricky. So I couldn't agree more, and it's sometimes not as effective. Those that are closest to the problem usually have the best solutions. So once again, I appreciate your transparency, your candor, your leadership, and that's a perfect segue to our final question because you just gave a call to action. So do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, a couple that I would share, just a few, and they're kind of build on the themes because I've been thinking about our conversation. But I really do believe that community services are a critical part of our social fabric, right? They're there to support Canadians when they need it and when they need their support. So really my call to action is, you know, if we want community services to be there for the long term, to be adaptive and innovative, we're going to have to fund them for the long term. We're going to have to fund them for mission. So that's my first call to action. The second one goes back to the labor force question. I think this is a conversation for all of us players within the community services sector and the charitable sectors. We're going to need to come together to say, what do we need? And what do our community organizations need? And to define what that looks like and to advocate for it. And hopefully our governments will come along and say, yes, we depend on community services to support Canadians. We want them to be healthy, strong, and resilient, and we want them to be able to attract great people who want to do purpose-based mission work. It doesn't just happen. I think we need the strategy. And my last question goes back to all the way at the beginning, or last call, is it's for organizations like yours and mine, and that is I heard somebody say that we kind of live in a perma-crisis. It's not that there was a crisis from the pandemic and it's over, because now we have a housing crisis, right? And we have an addictions crisis. We have a mental health crisis. We need to adopt a mindset that organizations need to come together to put all of their resources and their best capability together in partnership with others to try to get work done and to invest in community. So that call to action is, let's keep finding these ways to be collaborative and to take the best of what we can bring and align that with the best of what other organizations and people can bring. So support community services, find a labor force strategy, and let's figure out how to keep working together as community service leaders. That's my message.
Remarkable calls to action, remarkable closing thoughts. And I just appreciate your general consistent visionary leadership, your practitionership, and your thought leadership. So once again, Dan, thank you so much for all that you do for so many. And we'll close this interview the way we began, by acknowledging our creator, by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We acknowledge all our ancestors. We acknowledge all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all our elders, community stalwarts, whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you so much, Dan. We really appreciate you on behalf of the entire SETC team.
Awesome. And thank you again for inviting me. And it was a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate it.